Hello, 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 everybody. Hi. Welcome to East City Bookshop. My name is Laynie-Rose, and I am the humble events manager, and I will be with you tonight as we celebrate the Unicorn Hunters. Woo! How many of you are here at the store for the very first time? Hello, welcome, welcome. We hope it's not your last, so everybody else behave, all right? Okay. We always have something on the calendar here, and we've got a little something for everyone in June. If you are a lover of contemporary fiction, speculative fiction, and romances of all subgenres, I guarantee we have the event for you. All the information about our upcoming events and our 14 different book clubs can be found on our website. Do we have any book club members here tonight? So we have some future book club members here tonight, is what I'm hearing. Uh, Before we get to tonight's event, some housekeeping details. This is the boring stuff before we get to the fun stuff. Number one, if you could silence your cell phones, please. 2026, silence your cell phones. Thank you. Number two, if you need a restroom, it's upstairs past the cash registers and the greeting cards. Number three, we will have time for questions tonight for both in-person and virtual attendees. So even if you're watching via Zoom, you can participate. Please put those questions in the Q&A feature so that we can see them and can ask on your behalf. Number four, we're also going to kindly ask folks to not record the event as we are already recording the event. What did I write down? Most of our events are available on YouTube afterwards with publisher permission. So keep an eye on our YouTube if you're interested in recording. Please just be kind to your neighbor and don't hold your phone up for 20 minutes. Thank you. And finally, most importantly, if you need to purchase a copy of the book, we've got them. We're happy to help you out. All those copies are upstairs at the register and can be purchased prior to the signing line. And I always get this question after the event, so I'm going to say it again. Where are the books? Upstairs. Where are the books? Great, thank you. Um, I am so thrilled that we get to be here tonight to discuss this fabulous, enchanting, and empowering book. Has anybody here already read it? Okay. All right. So no spoilers tonight. No spoilers tonight. This is the kind of fantasy that you can sink your teeth into, and the kind of story I would love to see a woven tapestry of. In a desperate gamble to save her throne, a young monarch conceals a secret marriage in the shadows of an enchanted forest and unknowingly alters the fate of her world. Our author of the evening is Katherine Arden, who is the New York Times best-selling author of the Winter Night trilogy and the Small Spaces Quartet. In addition to writing novels, she enjoys aimless travel, growing vegetables, and running wild through the woods with her dog. Please join me in welcoming Katherine Arden. Big round of applause. It's a long walk. Keep that applause up. I told you it was going to be just like Friends. Welcome.
Thank you guys so much for coming. It's my note. Hang on. Pause. How about now?
Woo!
Thank you all so much for coming. I am so glad to see you. Before every single event, always, even now, I'm like, will anybody come? Will it just be me and a wonderful bookseller kind of staring at each other over a sea of empty chairs, which has happened to me as it has happened to every single author ever. And I am so glad to see you guys and that there are not empty chairs. So thank you again for coming. I am delighted to be here tonight in DC.
We are delighted to have you. So we'll start at the very beginning. Should be an easy question, or maybe it's not an easy question. You'll tell me. Where did this book begin for you?
Oh my gosh, where did this book begin? So it had a couple of different pieces in its origin story, but the biggest is that when I was 16 years old, I spent a year studying abroad, kids do, in Rennes, France, which is a major city in Brittany, France, where the book is set. And anybody who goes to Brittany will see all over sort of evidence of this Duchess named Anne. There's like Duchess Anne restaurants and bars and streets and different like cultural venues. And she's a person who is very important to the culture of not just France but Brittany in particular, this region sort of on the western side of the country. And as a student, I was like, who is this Duchess? Why is she everywhere? And I did some reading, and the story of Anne of Brittany is really interesting and somewhat tragic. She was the last ruling Duchess of independent Brittany, um, When she was crowned, very young, age 11, her father had just died, following an unsuccessful battle with the French, who wanted to annex the territory. And she was crowned. Sort of France had half annexed the country already, and the only thing standing between sort of Brittany and France was her. And she ruled independently for 4 or 5 years, sort of putting off the French by various stratagems. She contracted a marriage to somebody else, Maximilian of Austria, who was France's like greatest rival, trying to like create a buffer. She survived multiple attempts to like kidnap her. Eventually got cornered in Rennes and was besieged there, where she finally did sort of accept that she was going to marry Charles of France, and did so. Became Queen of France twice and had this huge influence on the French monarchy. But a wonderful kind of almost romantic story of this young girl fighting this hopeless battle. And so I was always intrigued by Anne of Brittany's story. And I think it's hard to read about her and not say, oh, what if, as a fantasy author, what if she had more options? What if the world contained more than it does? And what if those things could have given her sort of a different path to choose? So that was the first thread. The second thread is I had a book of folklore when I was growing up called Magical Beasts. And in this book of folklore, it was full of stories, fairy tales, and legends about different magical beasts, magical animals. There was chimeras and dragons and griffins, etc., basilisks. And the last chapter was dedicated to unicorns. It was just like a full chapter of stories about unicorns. And the first story in that chapter was about a unicorn hunt, set during the Middle Ages in a forest called Brocéliande. And I loved this story in particular. I read it many times. It was sort of dark and romantic. There was a hunt. It was pageantry. There was a maiden brought in to like bait the unicorn because it couldn't be caught otherwise. It was very sad. My first ever fan fiction was a retelling of this chapter of the story where the unicorn escapes with the maiden. I was 12. It was great. Um, so I had this in my head when I went to France as a teenager, and I bring it up in some conversation like, oh, this thing I was into when I was a kid, Brocéliande Forest. Um, and I think it was a teacher I was talking to was like, oh, Brocéliande, the forest, it's half an hour away. And I thought it was fictional, genuinely thought it was fictional, for my entire childhood. But it is not fictional forest. It's a real forest, in Western France, near to the city of Rennes. And so I got myself out there by hook or by crook and discovered the actual forest of Brocéliande, which is a very, very, very beautiful, very mystical place. It has like old trees and kind of still, quiet water. It has circles of standing stones everywhere. It's very associated with sort of Celtic mythology and also with Arthurian legends. It said that Merlin is there, he was buried there. It's where Vivienne seduced him. Of course, Brittany is also called Les Britain, associated with Great Britain, right? So there are these two halves of like the same kind of like cultural piece. And so you go there and you can imagine unicorns very easily, like drifting kind of between the trees. And so I had Anne of Brittany in my head, and then this forest of Brocéliande in my head. The final piece was unicorn tapestries. There's two kind of giant and famous sets of them. One is at the Met Cloisters in New York, The Hunt of the Unicorn, and the other is in Paris at the Cluny Museum, The Lady and the Unicorn. And I've always loved unicorns. I love the medieval kind, sort of the weird guys.
I love a weird little guy.
Sometimes they have goat feet, sometimes they have slightly strange eyes. They're a little smaller, a little bit like witty. I don't know, they just had more personality to me than like the modern unicorn. And I was like, oh, like the medieval unicorn is great. But especially in the case of the Cluny tapestries, The Lady and the Unicorn, I was fascinated by sort of the mystery they contain because there's 6 tapestries, and 5 of them are associated with the 5 senses. There's a sight tapestry, a hearing tapestry, a taste tapestry, etc., etc. The 6th tapestry is mysterious. It's called the "By My Will Alone" tapestry, thanks to the inscription sort of woven into this part of the image, and no one's quite sure how it associates with the other 5. Is it about like death or religion or setting aside the senses? No one's quite sure. But for me, as kind of a budding fantasy author, I was like, so what if the sixth tapestry was magic? What if that's what it was about? What if it was five senses plus a sixth, which symbolizes like the magical part of human kind of abilities, which is sort of the became the origin of the magic system in the Unicorn Hunters. So those were the three big pieces. Anne of Brittany, historically, the myths surrounding the forest of Brocéliande, and the unicorn tapestries, especially those in Paris.
And then you wove it together like a
That was a long answer.
tapestry.
Thank you guys.
Well, it was a beautiful answer. And I mean, the question we always like to ask, and I'm sure you get a million times with historical fiction, is what parts are real and what parts are fictional. But I more specifically want to ask, how do you choose when you're picking, this is something that I want to keep in, this is something that I want to keep out, this is something that I want to twist with my what if? How do you make those decisions and what in this falls over the line?
So, I mean, a lot of decisions in writing a book are made on the page, are made as I'm working. I do try and like plan some. I'm not a very good planner as a writer, and I tend to struggle to know if a scene will work emotionally, energetically, whatever, until I'm writing it. I've tried to get better at knowing if an idea is bad up front, so I don't waste a week being like, writing away and then it not working. But I still do struggle to see an idea and know if it's a good idea. I mean, don't we all sometimes? Like, I don't know.
Every day.
Um, right? Um, so there's a little bit of that as like I'm editing my ideas, and I do like to research and write at the same time because it's so easy to just start researching and dive down 80,000 rabbit holes and never advance because you're still researching. But if you make yourself write as you research, what happens is you find interesting things in your research that you bring to your writing. Your writing elicits questions. You go back to the research to answer your questions, and they become this sort of like feedback loop of interesting things and ideas that kind of build a story. Um, and every one of my books is different. In the case of Anne of Brittany, who is the main character of the Unicorn Hunters, it's the first time I've had a historical figure be central in my narrative. My other books have historical figures in them, but they're side characters. So it was definitely an active editing. What do I change about her life? What do I keep the same? Um, and the kind of the initial situation in the novel is very close to history. She's a young duchess. The French have, already won a giant battle. Her father is dead. They have a garrison in Brittany. Like the hope is that she marries the King of France. And that's it. Brittany is annexed. The king becomes Duke of Brittany, and that's that. So I start with history and then go wildly away from history in this case. And then that's not the case in my other books, but in this one it is.
I love. What was your research process like? And was there anything fun you learned along the way that you didn't know before?
I mean, I learned all kinds of things. I do enjoy research for that reason. You discover so much. I After I finished touring for my last book, The Warm Hands of Ghosts, I took myself off to Nantes, which I hadn't been to since I was a kid. And there's a castle there on the Loire called the Castle of the Dukes of Brittany. It belonged to Anne of Brittany. It's where she lived. It was her favorite place. So you can walk through it and kind of look at it and think about how she lived there and see the sky, the courtyard, the river. And I think being in a place can be really helpful. I also went to Rennes. I went to Brocéliande. I kind of went to the places I knew would be important in this book I was slowly conceiving. So that was important to kind of to begin to feel out how the book would sort of again feel how that would vibe. And I feel like the biggest thing I learned was the how courts lived in the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance is quite different, like sort of qualitatively from how we live now. Like medieval courts were not stationary. They were moving from castle to castle constantly, and they packed all their furniture with them. So the castles aren't furnished. So you're carrying all your stuff. So the king is just like
That's
constantly
wild.
like castle to castle, big giant line of furniture, like, the coffers are coming too, the beds are coming too, the linens are coming too. Um, and there's not a stationary like existence. You're always moving. They had much less furnishings than we do. There weren't any tables. They used trestles and boards and cloths, which were put down for meals and then taken away again at the end of the meal. They had sort of coffers for clothes. They had beds and linens, but it wasn't like they have tapestries for like warmth, but it wasn't like us where we have like specific, like an, I don't know, an armoire or like a sideboard, all these things we have today. They just didn't have. There weren't forks. They didn't have forks yet. Forkless society. Um, so like again, you think about these things like it's just different. And like another big piece is sort of the pre-industrial Europeans slept in two pieces at night. Like so you go to sleep with the sun and everyone wakes up around midnight and you're awake for about 2 hours, called the watch. And people were just awake at night for an hour or two. And
I do
people
that too.
it's natural.
That's what I do.
People would like they would talk, they would feed children, they would tell stories, they would just be awake and then go back to sleep for 3 or 4 more hours until the sun. And so again, that kind of way of living is just different than how we live today. And I tried to think about that as I was writing, how the world might be on a sort of a very nuts and bolts level. Nobody ate breakfast except for kids. There wasn't really a breakfast thing as we know it today. You might have like a glass of wine, maybe in the morning, but you very much like dined and then had like a smaller meal in the evening, unless you're like feasting. But even like rulers didn't feast all the time. It was special. So that's kind of stuff for like how did you
Yeah.
eat? How did you live? Where are the forks? No forks. Okay, like things
That's
like that.
fascinating. I love the
Um,
research rabbit holes that
yeah.
authors go on where it's starting with one thing and then suddenly you're like, no forks? Well, the book is primarily centered around Anne, as we know, but there is a delightful kaleidoscope of ensemble characters who the story also weaves through. How did you go about plotting these different perspectives into the story? And did you have a favorite perspective to write on? And when are you going to write a Butter the Cat perspective?
there is a cat. His name is Butter.
It's my favorite.
It's kind of a golden cat. So, um, I tend to sort of like in my early drafting, I draft with a pen and a notebook, so it's quite fluid in the early stages. And I tend to add perspectives and add characters very haphazardly as I'm looking for different, almost like cameras to find different
Ooh.
sort of like sort of eyes on different parts of the story to be able to tell it. I'm not sure I would do a good job writing like a first person narrative because it keeps you in one sort of headspace the whole time. I mean, I'm sure I'll try at some point, but I might not be good at it. So the early drafts kind of added different people's points of view, and the main one is the main character Anne. But as you move kind of through her like her allies, her family, her enemies, they also have perspectives too. Um, and oddly enough, the latest, the sort of very last perspective I added was that of this child, this Breton child, Elspeth, who is sort of the companion of this cat. She came in like the third draft, actually. It was late.
Wow.
Yeah, so sometimes you have to add things late in the game to make the book balance.
Well, I adore her. I adore all of them. I love how it makes the book feel so full. I especially love that we get to see all the different sides of the conflict is really interesting. But I specifically want to talk about her siblings and everyone that she keeps in close counsel. I was so moved by how much Anne and her siblings loved each other because Anne was willing to sacrifice so much, and it feels so big until you see how much her family loves her back, and you can see why it would be worth it to her. So, can you talk at all about those dynamics and how you thought about that driving the story, that love?
So I like writing siblings. I wrote siblings in both my other books, like my first trilogy, the Winter Night trilogy, has like a whole family's worth of siblings, who kind of have various roles in the narrative. And then the book, the follow-up, The Warm Hands of Ghosts, has a pair of siblings whose bond also drives the narrative. So I do like sibling relationships. I feel like there's a closeness there that is hard to replicate in any other kind of relationship, right? somebody who's known you from your, very earliest days, who's also in the same generation as you, right? So it's kind of this really important relationship. And historically, Anne of Brittany had a younger sister, Isabeau, and she had an illegitimate brother who was older, but he wasn't like a natural. He was natural born, so he wasn't eligible to become Duke of Brittany. His name was Francis or Francois historically, but um, Anne's father was also Francis, and so I didn't want to have like I was really trying hard not double up on names. I wasn't brave enough to just
Readers
like
appreciate that.
I mean, well, the Marguerite of France in the book, her name is she's Anne of France in history.
Wow.
So there was Anne versus Anne in history, like Anne of France, Anne of Brittany, and I just for a while I was like, I'll just do it. Um, and like I couldn't keep straight who I was
All
like
right.
referring to. And I was like, I can't do it. They'll hate me forever. Um, so so
Respectable.
yeah, so I had to change your name. I was like, I can't. Um, so I don't know. I felt like I love writing sibling bonds, like I said, and I think sort of one salient characteristic of Anne is even at a young age, she kept her court together more or less. Like there were French spies in the Breton court. There were people trying to get her to kind of like bend her principles. But overall, she managed to build and maintain courts both in Brittany and in France later on as the Queen of France. And I wanted her to be the kind of person who, in my kind of estimation, could do that. Could not just be sort of brave and bold on her own, but could build and sustain community, be a sovereign, essentially, be a late medieval, early Renaissance like sort of potentate. Um, and yeah, that was the goal in writing Anne and her family.
I love it. I love especially the older brother. There's almost, I feel like a trope expectation of like the illegitimate brother is going to try to make a gun for the throne. And I loved that you kind of, in a way, you really showed how much he loved his little sister. And I thought that was very special.
I mean, more than that, I felt like not everyone wants to be in charge of stuff.
Real.
And like this brother, like he likes to joust, he likes spending money, he likes like a nice outfit.
He's my
Um
best friend.
like and like honestly, it's very valid. Like I also would want to like joust and wear nice outfits and not like be defending like a beleaguered like duchy against the encroaching French. Like that's not a fun activity. Um and so Anne's like in the council chamber, like reading stuff, like taxes, like
Boo.
right? The treasury's empty. There's bandits everywhere. Like they just lost a war essentially. The French are like knocking the door down. Like it's not a fun place to be in charge. And I think Henry, her brother, is like very aware of this fact. And he's like, you can do it. And I'll like
You
help.
got this, girl.
I'm like, I'll help you. And also I like good outfits. So that's cool too, right? So it's just like,
I
I don't
love
know.
him.
Yeah. Right.
So, with all the people that Anne loves and who loves her, a big theme of the book, a couple big themes are trust and sacrifice. And I'm not going to get too into spoileries, but I love the journey that Anne goes on as she lives through those themes of trust and sacrifice. How much of these themes and ideas came to you as you were writing the story, and how much of it did you know you wanted to be a driving force of the story?
I mean, definitely I had ideas going in. So I guess the late Middle Ages, the early Renaissance, sort of marked this shift in how sovereigns related to their people. Like the medieval ruler, it's a very personal kind of rule. Like if you fight a war, the king is charging with the troops. Like he's also fighting. The king is divine in a certain way. Like he's sort of a direct like line to like God's like choice and God's like purpose for a country. Um, it's a personal, individual kind of authority. And the Renaissance began to slowly mark a change away from that and towards a sort of a state, like a bureaucracy. It was sort of very earliest beginnings of the machinery of a modern government, like very, very early. You had things like sort of treasuries, you had departments, you had advisors, chancellors. And so Anne's on the cusp of this. Um, And in the case of a queen, or in this case a duchess especially, a lot of her her place is tied to having a child, like having an heir. We're sort of before Elizabeth the First, who was kind of this exception, who managed to keep control of England without actually ever having a child and ever having an heir. But Anne needs one. Um, and she realizes that her biggest bargaining chip in this world she lives in is who she marries. She's unmarried, and the person who marries her becomes Duke of Brittany. Brittany is not just very wealthy; it's strategic. It's this peninsula sort of between England and France, two big giant rivals. It's got important ports. Like it's a strategic territory that her hand in marriage sort of can bestow upon somebody. And so she understands in her world that her biggest sort of tool for preserving the independence of the duchy is who she marries. And she kind of starts from this place of I have to pick who I marry and then go live with that person, and be the queen. And so preserving the duchy involves leaving it, involves giving it up, essentially. And that's kind of her accepted reality from the get-go in this novel. It's her place. Um, and and I think every sort of queen of that era understands that like being a queen's super risky. You have to have a child. You could die. Childbirth is very, very dangerous, for everyone who's having children. And it's just part of the risks she and every other queen ran, um, knowing she has to like give her hand in marriage and then have children. And in history, Anne tried, she needed to have two sons. That was kind of her, she managed to bargain the French down to like, okay, if she had two sons, the oldest son becomes King of France, the second son becomes Duke of Brittany. They can keep the territory separate in theory. But she needed two sons, and she tried for 20 years, and just only had daughters and her sons that died young. And eventually just like her body gave out, right? So it's a sad story. And I think that sort of sadness of her historical situation informed how the book began. And again, you want to give her like another choice. So
You said previously that you're always interested in how fantasy can elucidate history. Do you feel like that was a part of the process with Anne inspiring you?
I mean, definitely to a certain extent, like with this novel, it is unabashedly a book of like my personal wish fulfillment. Like I wanted this. And I'm sure there's gonna be readers who say, but it didn't happen that way. And I'm like, no, it didn't.
They're gonna be like, yeah, we know.
I know. And like obviously I understand wanting like a book that sort of like deeply examines the inequities and the responsibilities of, being born, as a ruling duchess in the late 15th century. And that'd be a fascinating book, especially Duchess who was, she's 11 when she's crowned, she's 15 when she gets married. I aged her up in my book because having her be 15, that would have been the entirety of what the book was about. You just, yeah. So I made her a young adult, but an adult in like the modern world, which helped, me write. And again, so it is wish fulfillment, right? It's okay. What if the world but with magic? What if the world but with unicorns? And I think a lot of us read fantasy for that reason.
Mhm.
Um, because you want to imagine things could be better than they were or are. Um, and that is certainly the case with the unicorn hunters.
I wish we all
Um,
had unicorns.
and like my last book, The Warm Hands of Ghosts, was a book where no magic in the world could make the world better. And that was sort of the
Woof.
place that whole novel came from. And it was a dark place. It was a sort of a dark, austere book. And one reason I was drawn to the Renaissance is because it felt very tactile to me. Like Brittany is sort of green and soft, and there's rain, and it's sort of this muted light and these like bright colors, horses, textures, stone, fabric, smells, like all these tactile things. And I wanted this very tactile, very physical world, kind of as almost like an antidote to me as a writer from my last book. So I sort of entered into this space of like color and movement and light, and I really enjoyed writing from that place.
Well, and you can tell in the writing too. I mean, your setting is so vivid and beautiful in the way you write. Do you see images in your head as you write, or does it flow out of you in a different way?
I see images. I'm very visual.
Okay.
I definitely have like the movie going. I had somebody write and ask me like, do you use visual references for your characters? And I was like, no, they just kind of like they're just in there. They're sort of like there's a face hovering somewhere in the, in the
So you don't have fan casts.
no. I mean, not no, not really. I've seen some that I've like, oh yeah, that could work or whatever. But I don't like make mood boards of whoever when I'm doing. I think it would limit me a little bit because like once you've stuck a real face into your head, I feel like it's harder to sort of find your own person in there. But love a
Um,
mood board, but it's not
I
how
love a
I
mood
how I
board.
imagine stuff.
That is true. Sometimes someone will say a fan cast. I'm like, well, that's just Hudson Williams, you know. All right. Um, and we had kind of started talking about this back there, but we all know that there has been romance in fantasy books since the dawn of time. That is not a new thing at all, but there is a current boom in romantasy and what readers are sort of expecting. So, did this current boom in romantasy and the market shift affect any part of the process of making this book, whether that be expectations from editors or marketing to readers or expectations, etc.?
I mean, I've been incredibly lucky in that I've never been in any way pressured to like write a certain thing or include a certain thing to like make the market happy. And there is romance in the unicorn, and I love romance. And I think just in general that like it's wonderful seeing any kind of boom in the publishing space, like more readers, more passionate readers. That's like fantastic. And I do know there is pressure coming to bear on authors sometimes to tailor their ideas or their words to like fit what the market might want. I am lucky in that that hasn't happened to me. My team's been great from the get-go. Um, and sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say we love a supportive team.
Yeah, no, no, definitely. And yeah, like I mean, booms are great. I do, in the case of romantasy, it's romantasy to me is essentially it's the YA fantasy has moved to romantasy, and like it's the same. It's kind of this like chain, of people, and it's great seeing the readers who like embrace Twilight, you know, move out of like the sublimated romance and into the real romance. From right. It's.
Growing with the audience.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's what it is. Come down to, and like, it's publishing comes in cycles. So I think we'll see something coming up next, sort of after the big romantasy boom. But like, who knows? Anybody who says they can predict the cycle is lying.
I know.
Nobody knows.
Maybe we'll have a hockey fantasy romance where they have wings.
There's a sports romantasy coming out. It's called The Winged Game.
I need that book.
Yeah, 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 yeah. It's got a purple cover. It's cool. Yeah.
And I love genre fiction, and I feel like a lot of us here we're here because we love genre fiction. And I was obsessed with your tone in the prose and how it felt like it really well balanced a sense of historical fiction, but also fantasy fiction, and was wondering how you went about approaching the tone for this book. There was also a sense of whimsy.
I mean, I like some whimsy. I definitely was trying for a slightly elevated sort of tone, so it felt properly Renaissance without going full on ye olds, like
Back in my day.
yeah, like or just like prithee, Sierra, like that kind of stuff. Like it can be a little stiff. So I didn't want it to feel stiff. I wanted to feel sort of more fantastical, but I also wanted to feel not like wholly improbable that we are now in the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance. I wanted to feel kind of like, oh, this voice works. I was trying to avoid modernisms. It's easy to like slide in sort of modern figurative language. Like a lot of the figurative language we use comes from modern references. Like, I don't know, like she felt a jolt. Like mom went nuclear. Even a lot of like English comes from like sailing terms, like taken aback is a sailing term. He won hands down is like a horse racing term. So you're trying to like find figurative language that is too modern and kind of prune it out and use a metaphorical world that makes sense for these characters versus one that makes sense to me. There's a lot of that, like trying to police the language a bit and find a voice that felt, readable, but not um, overly modern.
I love it. I love it. There was like a beautiful mix of the darkness of the magic and the things that she was going through in whimsy, and it was beautiful. Loved it. The last question I have before we get to audience questions, so start thinking of your questions, is if you could pick the perfect setting for someone to sit and read this book, where they're at, what they're drinking, what they're listening to, what would that setting be?
Oh my gosh. Okay. Um, I feel like it's a good book to read outside. So we're gonna go park on a picnic blanket, with like some pastries, what's called pastries, like do a little quiche, maybe like a raspberry tart. Um, and I feel like a glass of rosé. It's got glass of rosé
Mm,
energy.
yeah.
Um, if such a thing can happen. So yeah, I'd take it outside for this book.
Sitting in a park with like a croissant and the sunlight coming through the trees is the perfect. So that you all have your homework now.
I mean, yeah.
Um, Audience questions, and don't be shy. Yeah, back there.
Oh, hi. It's okay, yeah. Hi.
About your process because you said you write your initial parts of your book down. I've also started doing that, and I'm wondering when do you transition to actually putting the story together and maybe putting the words in a computer or something like how does that flow from those initial writing phase to your finish?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question essentially was, she remarked that I write my books by hand with a pen, and how do I go from initial pen drafts to like a typed manuscript to a finished book? How does that process look? Um, so I like handwriting drafts because I think to me it helps me concentrate. It is obviously slower than typing, but I think you make up for that um, in focus, in an intentional writing, because you can't just like sort of slop out words when you're using your literal hand and a pen. Um, and it also keeps your phone far away, which is also good for concentration. So I do love handwriting. It also gives you kind of almost like a hobby aspect to writing. Like I love fountain pens. I have, three fountain pens that I keep in a little three spaced box, and I love them all. They all have names. I can like pick the pen that suits my mood. All the nibs are custom grounds. I, picked each one really carefully. The third one I just got like last week. It was my present for finishing this book. You can choose inks that you like. You can really get into it physically, like notebooks you like, and having a a physical craft element to grab onto can really help your thinking. It becomes more like knitting or embroidering, writing with a pen than typing is. And I honestly think, at least for me, it helps me think to work that way. So usually a novel is about two. I use these sort of giant hardcover Claire Fontaine notebooks. It's a French brand. They have really thick paper. You can write on both sides of the paper, and it doesn't bleed through. And usually a novel is roughly two full ones. Very vaguely, it's about 100,000 words. Um, and sort of towards the end of that process, I think, people, my editor's getting nervous. Like my entire book is like just one copy and kind of a stained notebook. Um, but as I start moving towards the end, I'll often be moving almost too fast for the writing to keep up. So sort of towards the very end, I will often start typing just to be faster. There's kind of a rolling stone effect towards the end of a book. And then once I've gotten to the very, very end, I start typing up from the beginning, and it becomes a chance to edit as I go. It becomes a chance to make changes and make alterations um, in the typing. And so the sort of first typed draft is the second draft. Um, and then what I try to do is like put it down for at least a week, if not like more weeks, and then come back. I change the font weirdly, and then read it over with a new font, which does help like with concentration. And I make markers with like a red pen in the margins, and do an edit, and then I usually send it off to people to get reads at that point. Um, but as far as knowing when to switch, like sometimes I think for me the switch is I am thinking too fast to write successfully. I need to type. And there is, again, towards the end, sort of a just speed that happens as you're rushing towards the very end of the book. And I kind of want to honor that. And if I have to, I type it. So that is how you know, for me at least.
And I'll just piggyback off of that real quick because I'm sure many others were thinking, how long does it take you to write a book?
Ooh, I mean, it's very so wildly. Like Warm Hands of Ghosts took me almost 5 years. It was a book that's went through many, many drafts and many, many like ideas and alterations and like it worked through. Unicorn Hunters took probably 18 months from start to finish. Let's see, my fastest book was a kid's book, Small Spaces, and I got the first draft. It was in a legal pad, and I got that first draft in like 2 weeks. So I was writing really, really fast. And it's obviously shorter, obviously, for a kid's book. Um, and then let's see, The Winter of the Witch, which was the third book in my first trilogy. I wrote pretty quickly for me. It was about a year. So,
Wow, very impressive.
I mean, like Danielle Steele writes like 6 books a year. Like some people can write really fast. It's very individual though.
Other questions? Yeah.
Like Breton the language. I didn't put any Breton in the book. Um, like which should so the question was talking about putting Breton like words in the book. Oh, like Brittany.
Like referencing.
Oh, okay, sorry. So the book has no Breton words, but there's a Breton's a the Celtic language. It's a different language than French. And native speakers in Brittany often speak Breton and not French. French is later. When I was a student in France, there were still Breton speakers running around. And historically, Anne would have spoken French with her court because the court was French largely. But the Bretons were native to the area. Anne's family is French. Um, and she would have learned and spoken Breton with her servants, with her nurse, and with the people of Brittany. So there are two languages at play in the novel, French and also Breton.
About how this story has its kernels in your own childhood.
Mhm.
Are there any stories that are kind of a dream that you write in the future, but that you haven't really gotten a full grasp on yet?
Are there any stories that I would love to write in the future that I haven't gotten a full grasp on yet? There's so many. My head is a little bit of a stew of different sort of half-formed ideas. And some ideas won't be novels. Like there are ideas that you have that you might think are novels, they don't grow well. But I have so many half-formed and like almost fully formed ideas kind of floating around. It's more a question of like which one do I want to sort of pull from the ether and start working on. Um, and then which one will my publisher publish also? There's that question too. So it's like a little bit of negotiation, but there are many, many ideas floating around, and I would love to keep writing books and pull more of them out as I go. So it's a good question.
Ooh, we've had a few hands shoot up right there. You right there with the bangs. Great bangs.
Oh, that's a good question. So how do you decide if a book's going to be a part of a series or a standalone? Well, for my first trilogy, I was very inexperienced. I had never written a book before. I had just graduated from undergrad. I was not planning to be a writer. It was very ad hoc. I got my degree. I had this plan to be a linguist. I wanted to be an interpreter. Also, I spoke French, Russian, English. I had these sort of language triad. But I took a year away from school to work on a farm in Hawaii because I had been in Moscow for 2 years and in Vermont for three by then, kind of in succession. And I was tired of the cold. My entire thought process was
Real.
I was over the cold. And so I ended up on this coffee farm on the Big Island, like picking coffee. It's very boring. And so I decided to sort of write a book in my little notebook to like pass the time. And I enjoyed writing a lot. But I made every mistake in the book. Like in the first draft, the main character had like 8 siblings, and they all had different names that began with the same letter. I was so confused. Um, I remember my first time writing dialogue, I like got to a place where somebody had to speak, and I was like, what do people say? Like, what would someone say? I was panic. Like, what would they say? I don't
I've
know.
never said words before.
I don't know. And so it was very much, and so one of the mistakes I made, I didn't realize sort of how much plot you could fit in one book. I had too much. I'm kind of moving along and I'm like, oh, I have too much plot. So I, again, very ad hoc, like, oh, 3 books will be enough for my plot.
Why not?
Um, and, and it wasn't exactly in a way. When I sold the first book, one of the conditions of that contract was that I would take my draft, cut it in half, discard the second half, which was bad, rewrite the first half, which was better. And that became the first book, The Bear and the Nightingale. And then what I tried to do for the second book originally was to take my discarded second half and redo it into a whole novel. Failed entirely. I spent 6 months trying, it didn't work, and I told my editor, I was like, I can't do it. And she was like, she didn't say she knew that it was bad, but I
Very
think
nice of
she
her.
thought in her head it's because it wasn't good, Catherine. So she was so patient and kind about it, and I went back and wrote it again, took a different kind of like tack with the book, and that book became the second book, The Girl in the Tower. And so by The Winter of the Witch, the third novel, my any plans I had for my three books, my plot were fully out the window, far away. I knew the end. I knew I wanted to end at this one historical battle, this battle of Kulakova. But the way I got there changed completely. So the first series, it was hard. It wasn't very well planned because I didn't have a sense of planning it. I was kind of going along in a very kind of like books, way.
Yay.
Yay, novels. Um, so it's sort of not a good example. But for my other books, I knew Warm Hands would be a standalone because it was like kind of this one shot, one world thing. For Unicorn Hunters, I would love there's a second book in my head. It's two. It's a two-part story for me. But I'm not sure I will do the second half. Um, depends on the first book, basically, if it does well. I can do again. And I would like to, but it's not sort of guaranteed, I guess. So hopefully. But to me it is a two-part, two-book series. It's a duology.
This side over here, I haven't forgotten about you. Yeah. Ooh.
That's a great question. So I did a lot of making notes of like a lot of religious sort of like figurative language, a lot of food. Anytime I found like any kind of like tactile or physical reference to like the Renaissance, this environment, I'd make a note and I would pull from that when I was looking at figurative language a lot of the time. Things like the book contains many words for different kinds of horse, in part because in the Middle Ages, horses were, they were the trucks, the sedans, like the coupes of the era, and different horse words mean something. Like they're important. It's not just like, oh, you're using too many vocab words. No, it's not a horse. It's like a courser, a destrier, a roundseal, these different kinds of horse. Um, and same with kind of up and down the space. I was trying to find a language and sort of find a figurative language that sort of fit the physical environment they were in. There's a lot of religion too. Like everyone's very Catholic, right? It's a place that is shaped and sort of permeated by religious faith that's so deep that it's like the weather or the sky. And so you have to like kind of like move yourself out of like our very secular, civil society and think, no, everyone's very religious. There's that too.
We have any virtual questions?
Based your stories on your elements you're trying to handle. Did you draw inspiration, your own experience of French culture in any?
So the question is, kind of always have explored other cultures as part of my writing. In this case, I was in France and in Brittany, Bretagne, I guess, in French. Um, and how did I like, go about like illustrating or like kind of like writing within that culture, and what did I try to avoid or do right? Um, like again, I read a ton. All of my sources were French language sources. I don't read Breton, unfortunately, and there's not many books published in it anyway. But I do read a lot of French, and the best kind of biographies and the best like sort of like background like books on like Anne of Brittany and also kind of the late medieval period are in French. Think about that space. So I did a lot of reading. Was the first thing I did, and then um, and there's a lot of like reading of fairy tales. Like there's some wonderful collections of Breton fairy tales. There's one called the Breton Foyer, Le Foyer Breton. which I read over and over again, has these wonderful, like, particular fairy tales from Brittany. And I sort of folded them back and forth with a lot of sort of care and a lot of thought. And eventually I sent to my publisher in France and was like, would you be would Brett he's from Brittany, would Bretons be enraged? And he was like, no, it's cool.
Do we have another virtual question?
That's a good question. So I'm working on a book. It's drafted now. It's being edited right now. So the question is, am I doing any more Small Spaces books? Small Spaces is my series of books for children. Therefore, um, I'm drafting. The book is drafted. It's in edits right now. It is a book called The Fear Collector. It is set in a haunted middle school. And it takes place in the same universe as Small Spaces. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I know you're not judged by their covers, but all your artwork for all your books has been so beautiful.
You can judge this book by its cover.
It is gorgeous.
Gorgeous.
Best of the year.
Yeah. That's a great question. So the question is for my book covers, do we have the same artist or I get input in the book cover designs? We definitely changed artist based on the 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 project. My first three books were done by an artist named Robert Hunt, who's a brilliant sort of painter. Um, let's see, The Warm Hands of Ghosts was in-house graphic design because it was more of like a sort of a graphic mod cover. This one was an artist named Serena Malian who had done sort of other fantasy covers, and my editor suggested her, and I was like, she's great, amazing, let's do it. And then she submitted, I had some kind of ideas, and she submitted two sketches of different like ways to approach the cover. And the second one was this kind of like built space, wild space kind of coming together, and I loved it. It was perfect for the book. And so then she refined the design, and we kind of went back and forth and approved it. With covers, I've never been like forced to accept a cover. I've always felt like respected as far as like my wishes were. We try to agree. Like you want everyone happy, your publisher happy, your marketers happy, the author happy. And so at least for me, it's always been a question of like everyone trying to get to a place where there is agreement and there is like consensus. And obviously, I this cover's great. Like everybody loved it. When it first kind of came out as like the final draft, everyone was like, "Yes, it's great." So
Gorgeous, gorgeous. You were there.
Yeah. Nowadays, I really do crave wish fulfillment books, but I also hate black and white villains, and I feel like you really scratch that itch with Winter Night. So my question is, how do you decide how generous to be to your villain?
that's a good question.
Such good question.
How do I decide how to be like generous to my villains? I think what you're saying is how do I make villains a little more like multifaceted? I mean, I think that the basic answer is villains aren't villains to themselves, is an important thing to keep in mind. And the only thing that makes a villain in the context of a novel is that their goals or desires are in opposition to the protagonist. That's the villain. The villain is the person or the force who puts themselves in opposition to what the protagonist is doing or wants. Um, and I think once you think that way, you start seeing your villains as like characters or people who have their own sort of like fully fleshed out sets of goals and ideas and hopes and dreams. And I think when you have that, it's hard to make somebody one dimensional. Um, I think if you're doing like, oh, the villain's evil, he does evil things, or she does evil things with a capital E, I think that can be a little bit reductive in some ways because nobody does that in their own head ever, right? You're doing what you think is best or right. And I think once you kind of move into that space of like everyone in the book is doing what they think is best or right, then it creates depth. Even if you still have characters you kind of hate, they're right to themselves. Um, or if they know they're not right to themselves, but they're trying to convince themselves they are, that also creates depth. Like any kind of personal conflict becomes like depth or more realism for a villain. So it's a good question.
I have so many thoughts, but they're all spoilery. We have time for one more question. No one wants to take the last one.
Yeah.
Yeah, Rachel.
Big book. So I'm curious if there were any fairy tales or books that you read either growing up or as an adult that inspired you to start writing.
That's a great question. So, are there any fairy tales or books that I read as a kid that inspired me to start writing? I was a huge reader as a kid. I think a lot of people who become writers are. I love to read. I read a ton. Um, One of my favorite books growing up was a book by Robin McKinley, a wonderful author called The Hero and the Crown. And if you actually read The Bear and the Nightingale, you can see like sort of the bones a little bit in there. Like in The Hero and the Crown, the heroine has a horse that she loves, named is Tallet, doesn't use a bridle. Um, and they go on adventures, like the title, The Hero and the Crown, The Bear and the Nightingale. So that was like a really strong early influence for that first book. Um, then let's see, I loved retold fairy tales. Also, Robin McKinley, she wrote retold fairy tales. And when I had came back from Russia for the second time, I was like, oh, I never read a retold Russian fairy tale. So that kind of became the origin of the Bear and the Nightingale. And then for the Unicorn Hunters, I always like paying this author because she is the best ever, but I'm a huge fan of Dorothy Dunnett. Has anybody read her? One person. Thank you, someone. Okay, she is the best historical fiction author I've ever read. She was a Scottish author. She worked in the 60s. She wrote this series of books. She wrote two that are amazing. My favorite is called The Lyman Chronicles. There's 6 books in the series. Okay, thank you. Yes, there's always somebody who's like, yes. Um, she's absolutely incredible. Her gifts are enormous. Her precision, her talent, her historical like accuracy, her emotions. She writes the best fight scenes, the best action scenes of any writer ever in history. Like I can't say enough good things. And I always tell readers, like you have to give her some time because her writing is very dense. It makes no concessions to the reader. You have to just keep up with her. And you won't understand everything that's happening until the end of the book because she's smarter than you. And so is her main character. Like full stop. Full stop. But with her first book, it's called Game of Kings. The hero is a disgraced Scottish nobleman named Francis Crawford of Lymond. I always tell people to give it until you know who the Spanish nobleman is. Just you'll understand when you get to it. Once you know who the Spanish nobleman is, you're either in or out. But once you're in for life, you're obsessed.
I'm intrigued.
Okay, like actually read her books. She's so great. And if enough people read her books, we'll get a TV show.
Can you say the name one more time for
Okay,
our...
so the series is called The Lyman Chronicles, Lymond.
I see people pulling out their phones. Yeah.
Actually though, and they got a new re-release recently with like super cool new mod covers. So yes. And the first book is called Game of Kings. And George R. R. Martin definitely read it before he wrote Game of Thrones. Oh, see, it's right there. He has it. They have it. Everyone
We
can find
have it. Fight to the death. Well, our final question of the evening is going to be, what are you reading right now?
That's a great question. So a month ago, I found a copy of a collected book of short fiction by Eudora Welty in a bargain bin, and I like took it home. And I loved it so much, and I had never read her before. And I was like, it embarked on this project to like read more 20th century women authors because I realized that I had a huge gap in my reading where I hadn't picked up enough women in the 20th century. So I went to Willa Cather next, and I read Song of the Lark and My Antonia in quick succession, and then I switched to Edith Wharton and read House of Mirth because I'd only read Age of Innocence before that. And then I did Virginia Woolf and read Mrs. Dalloway because it was a wonderful like post World War One novel. Um, and so I'm like charging. I read Jamaica Inn by Daphne du Maurier, an older classic of hers. And then I have Toni Morrison on the docket because I gotta go that direction, and Octavia Butler. Um, and I'm just in this like 20th century place. I want to read The Heart's Lonely Hunter by Carson McCullers, and I read The Thornbirds by Colleen McCullough, which is great. And so it's been fun reading from a particular like sort of point in time and seeing how the books kind of converse with each other. So that's been my project this year is reading 20th century.
That is wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Round of applause for a great
Thank
conversation.
you guys for coming. I appreciate it.
This book is so fabulous, and I'm so excited for you all to get to read it. But before you can get to reading, we got to get to signing. So first, I'm going to send Catherine back to our lovely green room. Um,
Back to my closet. All right, I'm
back
ready.
to
I'm ready.
our lovely
It's a
closet.
beautiful closet. It's
Lovely
lovely.
closet.
It has water. It has my markers.
Yep. So I will
It has
send you back
mugs.
there as we start going over signing line details. And another round of applause as we make our way